pop-up Mini-Hoon on the kaka, and welcome to a good old friend of the show. I'm not suggesting he's old, but I hope he's a friend. Craig Rennie from the CTU. Craig, lovely to have you here. You've got a big, new, bright idea to for people to think about, because over the next day or so, we're going to get a government proposal for electricity market reform, but you've come up with one. What do you think we should do with our electricity sector to start with, before we diagnose the problems and then the solutions?
Sure. So the CT has been thinking about this for a long time because we've started to see big job losses in places like Tokoroa, Nelson, in Auckland, with energy prices going up. We've started to see household prices going up by 11.4%. So the big idea from the CTU is that we should be bringing electricity back into public ownership. And the really simple reason for that is there are very large profits being made. There's a lack of investment, and we need to do something about that because we're rapidly de-industrializing as a country, and we need to think about energy and electricity, importantly, rather than being a center for profit. How do we think about electricity as being a public utility like water or like the health service, so that we have enough electricity in the country so that people can turn the lights on, without fear of the electricity bills, and so that we're delivering economic growth in new industries and new sectors, and electricity doesn't become a barrier to economic growth in New Zealand.
So just the headline, how would you do it? Because, that sounds like a big chunk of change to buy back those 51% shares in Meridian, Mercury and Genesis.
You're absolutely right. It's a multi-billion-dollar bill, but what we're not suggesting is that the government turns up with that money on day one and says, we'll have all of those back, thank you very much. Instead, we want to use the very profitability of those firms, because the government collects 51% of the dividends because it's 51% shareholder. And instead, we use those dividends to start buying back the shares of the companies. The reason that's important is the faster those companies make profits and dividends, the faster they will be back in public hands. If they instead use those profits to not provide dividends, but instead to build new generation, then one, we get cheaper electricity, we get more stable electricity, and we're all better off. Or we buy back the shares, we get more dividends, which means we can buy back the shares faster, which means we're all better off. We use the very thing we're all worried about, which is the profits of those firms, to help solve the market problems that exist right now in electricity in New Zealand.
So let's sort of step back and look at the problem that has to be solved. You've described it as a market failure because in particular, our prices have risen. And I just wanted to steal some of your slides and put them up for our audience to have a look at on the issues in our electricity market, just to demonstrate what we've got here. So these are slides that will seem familiar. So I hadn't realized how much of a pivot or a inflection point there had been in electricity prices. Tell us what's gone on here, what we're looking at.
So this is an index of the electricity prices over the past few years, and what you can see is the kind of hockey stick of electricity pricing. As we said just a moment ago, electricity pricing this year has gone up by 11.4%, and that's building on previous compound changes. And across the period, you can see there's been a 30% increase in electricity prices, but 19% of that increase is in the past 4 years. And that shows no sign of abating. Gas prices are up, and that to some extent is leading electricity prices elsewhere. We've seen the cost of electricity being generated from Huntly and elsewhere again go up in price. The Electricity Authority is already signalling that wholesale electricity prices are likely to be higher again next winter because of climate conditions on the way through. So there's no end to this increase in pricing, and that's having two effects. One, it's affecting consumers because they're having to make decisions between heating or doing something else. and which is a decision we don't want anyone to be making in New Zealand. And two, it's causing the kind of economic change where, in particular, manufacturing sites are choosing to downscale. And for some sites, like Methanex, for example, in New Zealand, it's now more profitable for them to sell their gas into the energy market than actually to produce the goods that they're there, in theory, to produce. So we've got a real problem in electricity because electricity is driving really poor outcomes. Um, but it's a perfectly rational place for that electricity market to be. It's profit maximizing, it's doing everything right for itself. It's just leading to really poor outcomes for consumers and for the wider economy in New Zealand.
So prices have been rising, and normally when that happens, there's a market response, and the producer, in this case, the gen-tailers, the generator retailers, the big four, three of which are 51% owned by the state, they, in theory, should respond to those higher prices by going, gee, let's produce some more of this. The prices are up, a bit like a farmer.
Mm.
But what we've actually seen is something different. Can you talk a bit more about this electricity generation per person chart, which for me is sort of shocking?
Yeah, so around the world, what we've tended to see is electricity generation per person remaining flat. So we've seen in Australia, generation per person across the past decade relatively flat. It doesn't do a great deal. Um, Demand for electricity is going up. We've seen a 10,000% increase in the number of electric cars over the past decade. We have more electric heat pumps, more electric cookers. We use more electricity in our day to day lives. But actual electricity generation per person's fallen 13% over the past decade. And that's quite unusual. If we were having this conversation in Australia, it would be relatively stable. If having this conversation in the US, electricity generation per person has actually gone up. Um, but in New Zealand, it's had this 13% fall. Now, either that means we've had some kind of productivity miracle that where somehow using electricity much more efficiently, and to some extent that might be true, but it's not yet coming through in the productivity statistics, which are all pretty flat. And so that suggests that overall, pricing is just reducing the level of use in New Zealand. And that level of use is leading to exactly the problems that we're seeing in the economy right now.
So there'll be some people who are turning off their heaters, choosing not to use electricity at home. But, there's a lot of other electricity users in the workplace. And you've also got an interesting piece here looking at consumption of electricity by sector in a couple of major manufacturing areas. Can you talk about this and
Yeah.
give us a sense of how that's worked?
So we've seen essentially a collapse in the consumption of electricity in wood, pulp, paper, printing, um, and that is led by wood, by paper and pulp production. So that's companies like Oji Tokoroa going offline. That's Windstone Pulp and Paper in Penrose and Auckland. Um, now, there are some sites where they're fed by geothermal energy. They're still going. But elsewhere, electricity consumption is falling rapidly because it doesn't make economic sense at current electricity prices to continue to produce wood and paper and pulp products in New Zealand, which is kind of balmy when you think about it, whereas we're two very large islands covered by trees. Um, and yet we can't afford to process the trees on New Zealand as a consequence of the electricity pricing. And similarly, chemical pricing, electricity is a really important component part into chemical processing. And again, we've seen a near 50% fall in electricity consumption in that area. This is all part of a wider story of that de-industrialization, which is being born and delivered in certainly in large part by electricity pricing in New Zealand or energy pricing in New Zealand, making those sectors uneconomic here.
What about the argument this is all because Labor and the Greens stopped us exploring for oil and gas offshore, and we are now reaping the whirlwind?
Well, there's two things for that. One, we haven't found a new offshore gas find in 20 years. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars drilling holes in the seafloor and we found nothing. and we're unlikely to find anything. And even if we did, it wouldn't come on stream for years in terms of its ability to make a difference to the New Zealand energy market. Two, we have abundant renewable energy in New Zealand, be that geothermal, be that wind, be that other sources of energy, be that solar. And what we haven't done is actually expand out the delivery of that geothermal or that renewable energy. Instead, we've increasingly relied upon a few thermal energy outputs like Huntly coal-fired power station to deliver the backbone of our electricity. That's been great for the generators because it's meant high prices for the generators, but it's been terrible for the consumer because we live in a country that should have cheap, plentiful renewable energy, but instead we're reliant upon Indonesian coal-fired power stations to make sure we keep the lights on. That's what I mean by market failure. The market is delivering a perfectly reasonable outcome for itself. It's profit maximizing, but as you can see by these two sectors, it's driving terrible outcomes in the rest of the economy.
Yeah, because you think when there's a problem such as not enough electricity and prices going up, that it's caused by some sort of natural disaster or maybe some sort of financial disaster, and that the companies, have all gone broke or something like that. But you've also got a chart in your proposal which looks at the cash dividends that have been collectively generated for shareholders in these gentailers in the last 15 years or so, and then also what's actually happening with investment. So can you talk a bit about the because decisions were made, we're going to pay spare cash back. In some cases, we might even borrow some money and give that money to our shareholders. So they're not making losses. So you'd think they would have plenty of money to build new generation. But what's happened here?
So, I mean, first of all, I'm indebted to my colleague Ed Miller at SICTAR, who's helped pull together this data and who's been a genius in this area. So, thank you to Ed for this. What you can see is a black line, and that black line represents the capital investment of generators. Now, there's a little dotted line on the screen, and that is when partial privatization took place. Before partial privatization, we were spending increasing amounts of money on investment, on new plants, new equipment, new things. Um, Dividends were low, and dividends were always below the level of capital investment that existed. Now we have a decade of what we call lost investment, where we saw very large dividends returned to shareholders, dividends often well in excess of the profitability of those companies. So they were giving more money back to the shareholders than they were actually making during that period of time. Um, but investment collapsed. Investment fell from $1.6 billion in 2011 to $225 million in 2025. And it essentially stayed there for 5, 6 years. So dividends started investment started to come back, started to occur back in the sector. But some of that investment actually isn't buying new equipment. It's just larger operators buying smaller operators. Now that looks like an investment, but there's no new electricity being generated as a consequence. So we've seen this loss of investment and at the same time, huge dividends being returned to shareholders. And the market overall, we're all suffering from that lack of investment in less secure supply and in more expensive electricity.
One of the arguments is, well, they couldn't invest because of all of this RMA and consenting issues, and they couldn't get new dams built, and they keep getting knocked back when they tried to put up windmills, and they didn't really have a way to invest. What do you think of that?
So we've had gigawatt hours of electricity consented for years. It just hasn't been built. Um, uh, um, there was no appetite to actually build the kind of renewable network. So, for example, we have large geothermal reserves in the North Island, in the middle of the North Island, often on iwi-held land, which would have provided job opportunities, which would have provided investment opportunities, and we simply haven't taken up those opportunities. Instead, we allowed the market to create an equilibrium, a balance of supply and demand at a point where electricity was both expensive and was reliant upon thermal generation, often from coal. That reliance has created the profitability, allowed the dividends that you see in this chart. But what we haven't done during that period of time is invest in the new generation, because essentially for the past decade we haven't generated any net new electricity. We've got around 40,000 gigawatt hours a year, and that's as true as it was in 2014 as it is in 2024. And it's not as if New Zealand's population didn't grow during that period. The population went up by about 1 million during that period. GDP rose in real terms by about 30%. What instead we saw was profit taking, because it was relatively straightforward, and a lack of investment. And now those two things essentially are the reason why we think we need to, A, move the system back into the public sector because we've got poor outcomes, but two, those two things have led to the high prices and low investment that we face today.
Just finally, Craig, the other argument that people say when you say, well, let's use the dividends to buy back shares and let's invest rather than pay cash back to shareholders is, well, the government needs some money. 51% of those dividends will come in and that'll help reduce the deficit and reduce the debt. And that's more important than, low inflation in electricity prices. What do you think?
So a couple of things. One, if we're using the shares to buy more of the companies, we have another asset. So we're actually reducing the debt because net core crown debt minuses off the assets that we owe. Two, we're paying anyway. We're paying in higher unemployment. We're paying in higher health costs. We're paying in higher housing costs because the country is paying because we're having to deal with the consequences of people not being able to put the heating on. We're paying with the consequences of companies not being able to deliver goods and services because they can't afford to because of electricity costs. We're paying because of the lost investment opportunities, because whether through Amazon or not, things like data centers that should exist don't, because we can't afford to turn the electricity on. There's a real opportunity cost that exists from the current market setup that we have with electricity, which if we were to move to a different set of systems and a different set of incentives, arguably we'd have more electricity, people would be able to use more electricity, which means things like electric cars, other things would be more incentivized in New Zealand. We'd have more jobs, and those jobs would be more sustainable into the future. All of those things are the kinds of good outcomes which we are trying to buy elsewhere, but which we could be buying through making sure we have a better electricity system.
Craig Rennie from the CTU, thank you very much for coming on to a pop-up Mini-Hoon and having some fun with charts and trying to understand this huge part of our economy and, something we all know and use, and I'm using right now to produce this podcast. Thank you very much, Craig Rennie. That has been a Mini-Hoon on the Kaka. I am Bernard Hickey.